Faith Paths to Peace. My name's Judd Hendricks, and I want to welcome you to our Integral Life and Leadership program that we started 3 weeks ago, or 2 weeks ago. Today's our third week, and so I want to welcome you, those of you that are joining us on Facebook Live, as well as those that are joining on Zoom. I am accompanied with my three incredible partners, my conversation partners, and I just want to give a shout out to Wes, Dave, and Alicia. You guys have been great to talk with, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today. For those of you that are joining us on Zoom, there will be a moment where you can join in on the conversation. I ask that you keep yourself mute. You can also use the chat box if you have a question during the kind of teaching time that I'm going to do. You're welcome to put a chat in there, but also want to encourage you to engage in the conversation. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, also welcome. It's good to have you there. You're welcome to use the comment section or the chat box to put in a question or a comment, and we'll bring that into our conversation as we go. So again, welcome everybody to our third Integral Life and Leadership. Today we're specifically looking at the integral maps and politics, or what we call integral politics or developmental politics. And we've got several good conversation partners that are joining us as well today. And we're also being joined by Martin Brooks. I want to give a shout out to Martin. I've invited Martin to come and join in on the conversation. We were in a conversation on Sunday with a group of folks, I guess from all around the country, Martin, that were interested in reading this book or talking about integral. And so I invited Martin to come and join us for some conversation. So welcome to you as well, Martin. I want to do a quick shout out to my conversation partners before we jump in. Wes, and then Dave, and then Alicia, would you guys unmute yourself and introduce yourself a little bit? Thanks for being on again today.
Howdy, my name is Wes. I'm he, him. I am a local entrepreneur. Under my brand, A Mind of Valor, I coach and work with entrepreneurs and artists to make the most of their discoveries and to untether their imaginations.
Thanks, Wes. Dave, how about you?
Sure. Hi, everybody.
Weinstein.
Oh, I'm sorry. I meant Dave Graffey. Sorry, Dave.
Hello, everybody. My name is David Graffey. I am recently retired from 40 years in organizational life. I'm currently doing leadership training, which actually uses integral as its underpinning framework. So super excited to be here today.
And Alicia.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alicia Hollinger, and I am a sociologist by training. So I'm interested in patterns, relationships, and processes. And currently I am starting up a new family organization for the International Coaching Federation, the Thought Leadership Institute. So looking forward to the integral communications and dialogue today.
Great, thanks, Alicia. And Martin, would you unmute yourself and just share a little bit about yourself as well? Thanks for joining and being a conversation partner today.
Thanks for the invite, Judd. I'm Martin Brooks. I live in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm the current president of an organization called Peace Catalyst International. We're about 10 years old and have spent the last 10 years trying to bring conservative Christians and Muslims together. So in that space of trying to navigate relationships between majority and minority populations, we've learned a lot, and spiral dynamics has been helpful in that process.
Great, thanks, Martin. I look forward to engaging you some more in the conversation. So again, welcome. We'll have a chance for those of you that are on Zoom to engage in the conversation. The process that we've been using is I've been doing a little kind of teaching time and using a Prezi to do that. And so I'm gonna start the Prezi, and hopefully I won't have problems like I had last week when it locked up on me. And I'm going to use the Prezi to do a little bit of descriptive work of what we're going to be talking about, give you some maps and some visualizations for where we are. Again, today is about integral politics and economics. If we get to economics, I'm not sure we're going to have time today. And then I want you to put down next week where we're going to be looking at the integral city movement, specifically how these maps can be applied to creating a more conscious city, or what we call the beloved community. So I hope you'll come back and join us next Tuesday at 12 o'clock as well. So let's jump in today to talk about integral politics. I'm going to be using most of my diagrams in this work from a book that Steve McIntosh wrote called Developmental Politics. And Steve McIntosh has done a lot of work with integral. He came out with one of his, I think, first books was called Integral Consciousness and the Future of Evolution. I would highly recommend both of these books. I really think the developmental politics book is so important right now, and we're going to be looking at what he talks about, essentially some of the maps he provides in this book. So highly recommend both of these books, and they'll be kind of the source from which we're looking at information today. So I'm going to go back. The first week we were together, I talked about spiral dynamics and worldview theory, or what we call priority codes. I want to give us do a little deeper dive into these because this is going to be the primary map that we use for looking at integral or developmental politics. As we said earlier, spiral dynamics looks at these worldviews or priority codes that we go through developmentally in life, or we have the potential of going through developmentally in life. So I want to describe these different stages in the 5 maps. This is called stage development. And we're specifically going to be looking at what we call priority codes or value memes, and how we develop different priority codes as we develop in life. And these are not only related to individuals that go through these, but individuals that come together create cultural value systems that organizations possess. And we can see that these cultural value systems have evolved over time. So we're both looking at individual development, but we're also looking at a collective worldview development. I want to talk a little more about these specifically, but I do want to explain some of the background to these. What spiral dynamics looks at, or the theory behind this, is that there are certain life conditions that people live in that give rise to the value systems, or what we call priority codes. So we want to look at these environmental conditions, the problems and challenges of their existence. That shapes what they value, or the priority codes, or what we would call worldviews that they develop. And we've seen evolution show that cultures go through this. So there are certain conditions that prioritize survival, or getting food, or basic life conditions, and where they really have to be concerned about that. And so the priority codes, or the worldview, arises based upon those environments. And so what we're going to be looking at are these they're color coded often. That's how people think. So we're kind of looking at the center part of this when we look at worldviews. Now, these worldviews give manifestation to certain behaviors and beliefs. They manifest in certain ways. That's what people think and what people do. We're going to be looking at how people think, or how they rank values. And again, that's based upon their environment. So this is kind of the background theory to spiral dynamics. So keep this in mind as we look at these specific value codes. Here's some other basic information that we want to keep in mind as we look at these. Spiral dynamics describes systems and people, not typologies. So again, we're not looking at Myers-Briggs. We're not looking at people who identify as masculine or feminine. We're not looking at those kind of typologies. We're looking at systems within people, how they perceive the world and the values that they rank, their priority codes for living. Second, worldviews are not the same as religious beliefs. We're not talking how you express your religious belief would be at your stage of development or your level of development, not the religion that you practice. So I want to make a distinction between religious cosmologies and stages of development. You would express your religious cosmology from these underlying systems. That's why, for example, liberal, or what we would call, progressive Islam, progressive Christianity, progressive Judaism would look very similar to each other, maybe even more similar than they would if you were just looking at a fundamentalist or a militant Christian. And we also see that all those worldviews are expressed in all those different religious traditions. So you have militant Islam, you have militant Buddhism, you have militant Christianity, because they're expressing a religious belief out of a worldview or out of a stage of development. So I want to make a distinction between those. The spiral is a framework for how people think about things, not the things they think about. So we're looking at the containers or the capacity of their thinking and perception, not the details of what they're thinking. So it's what level of complexity can they think about those things, not what they think about. 4, there's no direct link with intelligence, gender, age, ethnicity, or other demographics, except that those variables influence the world around the person and either contribute to movement along the spiral or not. And so this is important to say, that we're not talking about people at what we're going to talk about in a minute, second tier, don't necessarily have, they can be from any race, any gender, any ethnicity. But to the degree that those characteristics influence one's environment, that may have an effect on the capacity of moving up. So that is an important thing to look at, is the environment in which people live. Is it conducive to development? Number 5, no level is inherently better or worse than another. And this is important to make note, that everyone at whatever place they are in this developmental scheme is intrinsically valuable, just because they are humans. Now, we also want to say that extrinsically they may be valuable different based upon what worldview or what gifts of priority help us function better in different environments. So it's important to make a distinction between intrinsic value and extrinsic value. If you're wanting someone to take in more perception or more perspectives around a point of view, or to integrate that, then someone that has that capacity would be extrinsically more valuable. But there may be times where you're not wanting that you're wanting a deeper perspective around, for example, somebody that may live in a primitive culture that has the capacities for certain gifts that come with a tribal type of consciousness. You wouldn't want them to be dealing with, the systems of a city, because they just wouldn't be there. So it's not that one is more valuable than the other. It's just there's a functional fit, which is what we mean by extrinsic value. Number 6, the theory is hierarchical in terms of conceptual space, the inclusion of progressively more factors and ways of understanding, but not necessarily in terms of intelligence in the conventional sense. So we're not just saying that these people are in some way smarter than other people. We're saying that there is a functional fit to their the way in which they see and think. So we're not necessarily talking about intelligence in the way in which we often refer to that. Seven, consciousness and evolution seem to be driving consciousness to greater degrees of complexity and awareness. Evolutionary biology shows us that we are moving to more complex ways of thinking as humans, that consciousness is moving towards the integration of greater degrees of complexity. And so that's kind of what we see is happening in the spiral. So all that being said, let me talk a little more about these particular worldviews and briefly kind of go through them, because we're going to then apply these to politics. We often give these developmental worldviews colors instead of giving them characteristics. So I'm going to use colors, but I'm also going to describe some of the characteristics of them. The lowest one that they've talked about is beige. We don't really get into much of beige because we don't see it often in our cultures. It's a very minimal form of living. Basically, you're just concerned with survival needs. That arose in the human species around 100,000 years ago, and its basic theme is just to stay alive. A movement up from that is when conditions begin to change, we begin to see the emergence of what we call the purple worldview. And here, it's kind of what we would probably consider a tribal worldview. And primitive, I don't mean primitive as a value judgment. I just mean primitive in the sense of early stages of human development. It's very animistic and very magical thinking. There's not really critical, rational thought. The trees have spirits. They don't. There's no critique of the mythologies or stories that they're telling. They're very clan-oriented, family-oriented. Morality is basically my tribe. What we begin to see is when people move out of that, it's very we-centered. And so one of the things you're going to see through the development of these worldviews is they move around the polarities of I and we. They can move towards identifying with the group, or they can move towards identifying with the individual. So they go up this spiral, going back and forth between I worldviews and we worldviews. And that's an important thing to watch. The movement of purple is very we-oriented. The identification, a sense of self is embodied in the tribe. To move out of that, there becomes a very impulsive red worldview. And this started around 10,000 years ago. It is the movement out of identification with we into I. It's kind of the emergence in a child of the egoic self. It becomes very self-centered, very concerned about its own needs. It can be ruthless as an adult. It's just concerned with its own personal needs, getting its own needs met. Now, red has, all of these have a form of organization that they like. In red, it's usually the most powerful person in the center, and then everybody responds to that person. So it could be seen as, the leader of a gang, or the patriarchy of the family. And that's, again, I also want to say that all of these systems are within us. We integrate and transcend them. So it's not saying we all have a red part of us, a red system within us. We don't often have to manifest it, but it's there. So it's important to note that we can all regress to lower stages of development based upon our conditions. Like when the apocalypse happens and all the zombies come out, all of us that think we're very moral, caring people, we know that you'll probably drop to trying to survive, and you may do horrible things to other people to fight over food. So we all have the capacity of regressing based upon our environment. The move up from that's what we call blue, and this is a purposeful authoritarian. This value system began to emerge around 5,000 years ago. This is where we see the emergence of all of our major world religions, because they often turn to an authority, which is a mystical, magical, theological God, or some kind of transcendent worship. And that authority gives them purpose for life. This is kind of when the 10 Commandments came down from Moses. It helps order their egoic power drives, some kind of higher authority. So it's very law oriented. You can see this in, you know, our current laws. Most of our religious traditions are based or come out of this worldview. It's very ordered, interested in ordering people, a sacrifice of the individual self to a transcendent cause, truth, or religious way of life. It has a very top-down, authoritative form of organizational. You know, it's usually a man at the top, or and they exhibit control. American military is based out of this worldview. It's very command control oriented. And again, it's very important. It's very important to help control the impulse of red. So we need this worldview, and you could probably find this worldview in your own self, your own developmental trajectory. So to move from that is the movement into orange. Orange is what we call kind of the modern worldview. The worldviews below this are often called pre-modern. So the modern worldview begins to emerge when rational thinking and scientific thinking come online. This is where the Enlightenment happens. This is where science begins to take forefront. You see the shift from a blue to an orange in the struggles that happened in Europe in the Reformation, away from an authoritative church to more individual centered, making a discernment about what I believe, that the individual, this moves back to the I, becomes the primary source for meaning rather than the collective. This is the primary stage they say that the United States is in. It's very materialistic. It uses resources to get ahead. The scientific revolution as well as the industrial revolution came out of this worldview. Again, about 300 years ago. It's very concerned about self, materialistic gain, and is very competitive. What began to happen when we begin to see that this worldview had its problems and challenges, specifically kind of environmental degradation? We realized it oppressed workers, it oppressed marginalized people for economic gain, is you begin to see what we call the green worldview, which became very communitarian. This is a movement back to we, started about 150 years ago. It's very concerned about equality. It's very concerned about uplifting the voices of people who have been marginalized. Feminism came out of this, womanism, a lot of our rights for LGBTQ populations. It was a way of being very sensitive to we. So this is a movement back into we, and became very critical of hierarchy, became very critical of economic development at the expense of people, cold rationalism. So you begin to see that, and its organizational form is very circle oriented. It's very, I want to hear everybody's perspectives and opinions, specifically those who have been marginalized. The sensitive self. There's kind of a reemergence of spirituality. This is what we call postmodernism, and its critique against extreme forms of rationalism. So there's this kind of new spirituality that emerges in green. So these are what we call the first level tiers. One of the things that we're talking about in integral leadership is the movement of our centerity of gravity away from first tier into what we call second tier value systems. And this really is what we mean by integral leadership. One of the things that happens in these worldviews is that you begin to see the deeper underlying codes of the whole system. In other words, you can appreciate all of the other worldviews for who and what they bring to the spiral. So you don't need them to change at this level of consciousness. It's not all of the other levels, the first tier levels, want the other levels to be just like them. They think their worldview, their priority code is the best. And so they're always trying to get other people to see like them, to believe like them, to do like them. But at higher levels, what we're talking about, integral levels, you can see and value each of the other levels for who and what they bring to the whole. And you can see that they're needed. So it's not about changing them, it's about helping them be healthy expressions of themselves. The first part of this is what they call yellow integrative, just began to emerge 50 years ago in human consciousness. And here you really do see all of the deeper structures of the systems. This kind of a Taoist perspective. You can see the flow of energy moving through these systems. You can begin to see these across the globe, and you can work within their framework in order to move them forward. The first one is a little more interested, so it moves from the we of green into the I of yellow, which just means it's more focused on kind of information. It's more focused on one's ability to see and understand these kind of flows and hierarchies and systems at a very complex level. The movement out of that is what I would call the movement from big mind into big heart. I don't know if you've heard of the big mind, big heart movement, but it's a meditative process that works with these kind of underlying systems. And yellow is very big mind, but turquoise moves into what I would call integrated big mind, big heart. In other words, it takes on the capacities of this deep sense of oneness with the people who express these other value systems. So you don't just cognitively understand them, you experientially feel one with them. It's a deep sense of compassion and empathy. So I call it integrated big mind, big heart. And we really only began seeing this emerge in human consciousness about 30 years ago. There is this kind of whole system experience, not just a rational experience, but you can feel the system, kind of an intuitive grasp of the whole. And then you can work out of that, not only with your intellect, but you can work out of it with your heart. So this is what we would call worldview systems and theory. I'm going to take a moment to take a break here and open it up to see if there are any questions. We're then going to take this theory and we're going to apply it to politics. So before we do that, I want to see if there are any questions of clarification going forward. Does anybody that's on Zoom or anybody joining us on Facebook have a question or comment? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I have a question.
Please, Natalie.
I was recently listening to something about what's called the law of one. Is this similar?
I'm not familiar with what the law of one is.
Okay.
So I don't know that, but you're making some connections there. What are the connections you're making?
How you color code and exactly how that went down as far as the years and the way it pertains to us as a society and people, and individuals.
Well, thanks for putting out that resource. I'll try to follow up and see what the connections are. Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any other questions, comments, clarifications before we apply this to politics?
I put an asterisk next to the note that we can regress depending on our environment and our conditions. And I think our political landscape right now demonstrates a lot of that. So I'm hoping to bring that back up later.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good point. That collectively we can drop if the environmental conditions require a different value set or different priority codes. And so in that way, we can have a lot of empathy for what we see happening. It's just saying that the environmental conditions, people are feeling more threatened at a primal level, which is usually, right, the reptilian brain, concerned about safety, security, survival. And I think that's one of the ways we can have compassion and practice that. So we'll talk more about that, but thanks, Wes, for reiterating that.
Yeah,
right.
Judd,
Go ahead,
I also
Dave.
want to, I want to throw out there too that each one of these stages have healthy and unhealthy parts of them. So while each of them is good unto its own right, that there are ways that they can express pretty negatively. And typically when that happens, as a matter of routine, it could be that that particular stage of development is now becoming rather unsatisfactory to us, and we're actually could be pushing into the next stage or potentially falling back. But each of these stages is wherever we are, is where we are, individually and as a society, and that wherever we are, we need to be attentive to the ways that expresses in a very healthy way, and if we're not aware, ways that it can express in a not so healthy way.
Yeah,
Thanks, Dave. Go ahead, Alicia.
I just want to add, I was thinking about that too, Dave, about just the health aspect. And I think it's important to really think about this on a spectrum as far as health, right, and unhealthy, because the Western medical model tends to put mental illness, either you are ill or you are not, versus just the spectrum of mental health, which is, you know, if you you might think you're healthy, but actually your ankle is sprained, right? And so there's parts of your system that are healthy, but you have a sprained ankle, which is the unhealthy part. So just really thinking about the spectrum of health it is, I think, important too.
And that's exactly what we're going to start talking about here in a minute. So thank you all. We're going to be looking at the healthy and unhealthy traits of these different worldviews, how they express themselves politically. So that's what we're going to move into talking about. So I do want to move in. What you're about to see now are some maps that I've taken from Developmental Politics by Steve McIntosh. So I want to give him credit for these and frame our discussion around politics. One of the things that Steve McIntosh does is he helps us make a distinction here between the ways in which political thought emerges. And what we're going to be looking at is what we call the bedrock values, which do give rise to specific issues and interests, which gives rise to political parties, which then give a rise to elected officials. I think this is important to note. So what we're looking at is these deeper underlying values, because we can get into polarity or get into polarization when we start moving up. And I want us to be able to distinguish. We're not talking about people. We're not talking about certain politicians or political parties. We're going to try to analyze the underlying values from these different perspectives. So essentially, we're not saying there are two parties. That's kind of part of our problem right now in American political thinking, as we talk about two parties when really there are 8 different value systems that are manifesting in those 2 parties. And that's essentially what we're going to be trying to parse a little bit. So we're looking at bedrock values that give rise to all of these other issues. What Steve McIntosh does is he breaks these down into different terms. So he boxes these worldviews into primarily 3 categories. The traditionalists, which would be in most of our sense, the red and the blue, he says is about 30% of the population in the United States right now. And he defines the value of traditionalism seeks to preserve our heritage and conserve the best of what has come before. So this is the definition he's giving to traditionalists, which we would put red and blue worldviews. That's what they're doing in some ways. They're seeking to preserve the heritage and conserve the best of as what has come before. The modernists, he says, is 50% of our population. Modernism is focusing on overcoming poverty and ignorance and on liberating each individual to achieve their full potential. So this is really the positive of what modernist worldview is doing, which is primarily orange. He's going to parse these in just a minute, but he originally breaks them into 3 different categories. And then postmodernists, he says, are 20% of the category, what we would kind of call green. He says, postmodernism is concerned with righting the wrongs of modernity by building solidarity for the protection of the environment and the achievement of social justice for previously marginalized groups. So when we put these into political terminology, he breaks them into those 3 groups. And you can see that 30% of population is probably in the traditionalist, 50% in the modernist, and 20% in postmodernists. So when you break it down to vote, those are the votes that you're seeking, because we'll most likely vote for the candidates that fit our priority codes. The next slide, he parses this a little bit more, and I think this is really interesting and I think helpful. Traditionally, we have this left-right polarity. He says that there's what we would really call the progressive postmodernists, and then he divides modernists with these 2 labels: liberal modernists and fiscally conservative moderates, modernists. So he's dividing orange worldview with liberal modernists that may have some tendencies towards progressive postmodernism, and fiscal conservative modernists, which might have leanings towards socially conservative traditionalists. So see what he's done here. He's taken orange and he's divided it between liberal modernists and fiscally conservative modernists. And he says the progressives are reaching back into modernists, trying to pull them that way, while socially conservative traditionalists are reaching into modernists, trying to pull them back. So that's where we have these energies. Modernism is really being pulled in these directions. So I want us to parse that a little bit, because this is the paradoxes that we're going to be working at. We're going to be using a process called values integration, or polarity management between values, value systems. So what he's saying is there's some real polarities happening here. One is what we would call between progressive postmodernists and the far right socially conservative traditionalists. I would like to say what we're seeing is a pull on socially conservative traditionalists to right-wing fundamentalists. So I think there's another circle over here that has emerged that doesn't actually fit socially conservative traditionalists. So this would be the red worldview, a real powerful red worldview that may be moving into a purple worldview, because they're concerned with survival issues. But to use this diagram, so that's the overarching polarity between green and red. Orange is stuck in between that, but within orange, there's some also other polarities. There's the polarity between liberal modernists and fiscal conservatives that we can look at. There's also a polarity between progressive modernists and progressive postmodernists and liberal modernists. So this is a polarity that's happening in a pull. And then the fourth one is between fiscally conservative modernists and socially conservative traditionalists. He unpacks these a little bit more, and we're going to unpack them a little bit just so you can see who he lumps into these categories. So I wanted to show you that. We'll come back to some of this when we start looking at what we're going to call value integration. And here's a couple of principles with value integration. One is that we focus on the positives of the other worldviews while also claiming the negative of the one that we feel like we're in. So if we're going to do values integration, you have to try to focus on the positive, and I'll show you how we're going to look at these in a polarity management map. You focus on the positive of the other while also being very aware of claiming the negative of where you are. So let's talk about that in a little more detail in just a second. I'm going to come back to, this is a polarity management map. I'm going to come back to this, but in a polarity management map, you look at what's the positives of the worldview that you're looking at, and then also look at what are the potential negatives of that worldview. Alicia, as you said, when it moves into being unhealthy, and Dave, where you were talking about, there's healthy manifestations and unhealthy manifestations of these worldviews. So I just want to show you that. Let me talk about polarities here in a minute. I'll come back to these. Polarity management is an important concept because that's what we're going to be using. Polarities, a definition here, are independence between two ends of a continuum where both ends represent the opposites that need to exist together to ensure long-term success of the entity. So we're looking at they're interdependent places along a spectrum that need one another over time for the health of the whole. So we can use the example of breathing, right? The polarity of the out breath would be one pole. So if you breathe out completely, you're embodying the pole. But to survive, you also need to breathe in. So they're interdependent with one another and require each other for the whole of the individual. So what we're saying is that for the survival of us as a species, we need other value priority codes. We need the healthy, positive aspects that they bring to the spectrum. And that is the way we begin to manage these deeper values, is that we focus on their positive and see the need for them, but not the too much of them, right? So if you breathe in too much, you get too much carbon dioxide. So you have to release that, which is taking in oxygen by the inhale. But if you get too much oxygen, you'll pass out as well. And so that's really the way we need to see, from an integral perspective, all of these value codes. We need them. We need them for what they give to the existence of humanity and to our communities. We just need the positives and want the positives of them. So let me show you how this works in what we call a polarity map. In a polarity map, and I'm going to take progressive postmodern caring values, the spelling here, and then socially conservative heritage values. So in a polarity, what we want to find are, what are the positives of a progressive postmodernist value system? And that's what we would put up here. We also want to be aware of the negatives of too much of those value rankings. And we would mark those in this box here. We also want to be aware of, if we're looking at the polarity between green and blue, socially conservative heritage values. What are the positives of those? And then what are the negatives of those as well? If we go over here too much, we begin to experience the negative of those. So what we're talking about doing is value polarity mapping each of these worldviews and seeing what they bring to the spiral, and then seeing if we can manage them using polarity thought. So let's use an example of doing that. Here's an example of an issue. So orange liberal modernists have been risen to globalism and some forms of global capitalism. Sometimes it's also globalism in the sense of multiculturalism. It's different from the blue socially conservative nationalism that we're seeing manifest. Now, nationalism was a good thing because when it came out of red, right? So blue was an integrative capacity of red. So it was needed, and it helped control red. But it manifested as nationalism. So what we would ask in a polarity map, what are the positive upsides of globalism? Well, economic globalization reduces poverty and promotes cross-cultural understanding. Globalization increases democracy and reduces human rights abuses. We have the UN emerged out of that. Globalism promotes environmental awareness and collective action on pollution. Global free trade makes business more competitive and produces better products. And increasing global integration deters wars and promotes international solidarity. Well, if you go too far out of these important values, you can run into the negatives of those. For example, global free trade creates a race to the bottom on wages and regulations. So that's what's happened with a global economy. Often you see the rise of multinational corporations that begin to continue to marginalize certain groups. It destroys traditional cultures. So, we've noticed the loss of these languages. One of the things that's happening all over the globe is we're losing tribal, ethnic specific languages towards this globalism. And that's a negative, I think, the loss of the particularity. It can result in unchecked multinational corporate power. It can lead to indifferent elitism and even reversal of patriotism, and replaces workers in developing nations. And you all could probably add to that. I'm just giving an example. So what we would then do is we would also talk about the positives of nationalism. Nation states make democracy possible. So even nationalism is a higher form of development from tribalism, or from, rule by a religious authority. Patriotism helps define personal identity and promotes self-sacrifice and civic virtues. I mean, we see the power of nationalism to actually promote values that I think are good for us. Joining together and having a national identity, a lot of times that's a positive. A national identity is more diverse than a tribal identity, right? So we can have our ethnic enclaves that when we identify as a nation, as a melting pot, I think that's a positive. That's a larger identity of a sense of self. So anyway, I think you can see what we're getting at here. I don't necessarily need to go into those. We can also then begin to name the negatives of too much nationalism. Ethnic nationalism can lead to nativism and racism. Wars between countries becomes more likely. Economic protectionism is bad for the economy. Xenophobia against the other. So in polarity management, what we would do is try to understand the important, healthy aspects of these worldviews. You can do that then with all different types of worldviews. And here's been some successful navigations I think, of underlying worldview development that's been successful. So one of the things we saw with gay marriage came out of a kind of a green worldview because it saw the oppression of LGBTQ individuals not able to marry. But one of the things that they started promoting was the blue value of family. Because blue value really does see the traditional value of people having a family, being raised in a family. Even though they may have defined that a little more, of course, smaller, one of the marketing messages was everybody ought to have the right to have a healthy family. And it tapped into a blue value. And so there was a linking there of a deep value of family and green standing up for those whose rights have been denied. So I think that's a good example of beginning to look at a deep value of one worldview and how to manage it so that both groups can have deep values met. Now, I'm not saying this is a perfect world in this argument, but it was, I thought, a good way in which they could come together to promote each other's healthy values. Marijuana is another good one. Marijuana's got this really interesting trans world view value system. One is it could be promote red that just says, I want to get high. Very selfish, just concerned about self. But it began to have an economic capacity that orange likes. So it could buy into this is good for our economic development. And also the green idea around marijuana of, promoting the ramifications of getting high, of feeling connected to people. We actually know people are less violent. There's some green values that also go along with kind of freedom of expression. So what's beginning to happen is we're beginning to see a deeper moving political policy forward because it can tap into the deeper values that each of these worldviews represent. Robert Keegan defines integral consciousness. Robert Keegan is also he's a developmental psychologist, but he says integral consciousness is the capacity to see conflict as a signal of our over-identification with a single system. So integral consciousness begins to see that conflict is just between deeper value systems. It's not about people, it's about their value system beneath them. And that's what integral can really bring to this conversation. All right, this has been a little thick. I can parse a little bit of this a little more if needed, but I feel like I've laid a lot on for us to at least open it up to some conversation. So I'm going to stop sharing and invite folks into, I would specifically be interested in starting with David, Alicia, and Wes and Martin. Would really like to hear some of what comes up for you. How have you used some of this thinking? What resonates with you? What critiques would you like to add? So the four of you would be interested in y'all unmuting yourself and jumping into the conversation. Whoever feels called. Martin?
Well, one thing that jumped out at me as I read developmental politics was how the different levels build on the previous level. And in the example of the example he gave in the book was traditionalist gave moral parameters that kept the modernists somewhat in check. They took these moral values into a modernist worldview that kept people from being totally selfish. As we move from a collective group identity to individualism, these moral values made boundaries. But as those boundaries were abandoned, you got the abuses that came from exploiting people, which the green responded negatively to and said we have to correct these abuses. But the green are typically standing on the shoulders of the modernist who had economic resources to give them the space to be able to go to university and think about helping others. And the green mindset grew out of, as a response to the modernist, but also because of the benefits that the modernists gave to the green mindset. So that was one thing of learning to value what came before. How did we get to where we are, and how can I see the good in what came before? Identify bad, but acknowledge the good and the privilege that it gave us to think more broadly. Second thing that came to mind was your comment about the traditionalist, and you were seeing the traditionalist, another group emerge. I forget how you phrased it, but I saw a similar. It seems to me, coming from a religious background that grew up in a traditionalist / modernist mindset. There's sort of a within the traditionalist in my lifetime, there's been and the modernist, some of the concepts of the modernist have crept into the traditionalist mindset. For example, this idea of individualism that comes with the modernist. In Protestantism, you had the idea of I can interpret God, I can interpret Scripture on my own. I don't need the Catholic Church to do it for me. And so there was this modernist idea of of empowering the individual that came into the traditionalist mindset. So, and I think what you're seeing, what you identified, Judd, was within the traditionalists, there are people who are saying we've gone too far, embraced too much of the modernist idea, and they're embracing the authority figure again. I think that feeds into the political thing. People are looking for a hero, somebody to speak for them. So those were a couple of things that came to mind as you were speaking.
Thanks. That's really helpful. There are a couple of things I want to come back to, but let's have some of the other folks jump in. Dave?
Yeah, I think what pops up for me is how important it is as we adopt and try to include this map, this integral map, is what you said earlier, that we do have all the previous stages and worldviews in us. And it seems to me, as I've watched my own navigating and looked at the world around me, is that it's really easy to say, oh, I'm orange or I'm green or whatever, and to, in a sense, to cut off some of these healthier aspects of earlier stages that still reside in us. I remember a particular moment in my life where, I don't have a ton of blue that dominates my discretionary ways of thinking. And I visited my son and went to a church service that was extraordinarily traditional. And it had me weeping. And it had me weeping at the submission of the people in the service to the glory of God, to the glory of, in my language, would have been to something that's bigger than my own mind can process and my own egoic identity, that there was something so beautiful at the chosen humility to bow down to something unseen and mysterious and bigger than self. And I remember walking away from that really with the sense of I need to accept and integrate more fully these previous stages because they don't go away. So my ability to really see and love and care for folks outside of my stage tribe was entirely dependent on my ability to soften and love and include the previous stages that still reside in me. I still harness red when I need to, and sometimes when I don't need to. That's the unhealthy pieces of it. And I still respect, law and order. When the protests were legitimate protests, no problem. But when they became violent, then it was like, then the law and order part of me wanted to jump into, wait a minute, we can't be, smashing and trashing and beating people up as part of this movement. So for me, the takeaway was really to be brutally honest with myself about where am I actually cutting myself off from earlier stages just because of some egoic identity that I was forming.
Thanks, Dave. That's a beautiful description of naming and claiming all of those parts of ourselves. Wes, Alicia, one of you all want to jump in? What's emerging for you? Wes, you're still muted there.
When I go back to the notes on spiral dynamics and I think about how our environment really gives rise to our worldviews and how we think, and I kind of put that against the egalitarian meme, I wonder, well, I'm left thinking, how has the internet age, though it opened up access to greater resources and access to understanding certain things, hasn't just caused more polarization? And with that green and the reemergence of spirituality and rationalism, it almost is as if systems under capitalism, e-commerce, and the like have created a spirituality that it's less spiritual, but it's more built into these algorithms, and just it's like more of a false sense of community. It's almost irrational to build relationships with strangers across distances based on information that someone willingly submits that doesn't necessarily get verified, right? So we're left to build these systems from the green moving forward, and yet I don't know if it's brought us any closer. From that, I'm left thinking that capitalism also grants rights to these different environments and creates access and privileges and permissions that sometimes causes us to be in conflict, not so much because of over-identification, but because we're forced to submitting to a national identity that might suppress other identities, that are directly tied into a person's values. And when a person's values is threatened, their natural response is to try to create more space and to definitely grow their support base. And so it's in conflict with one another. And so it ends up creating more polarization. When you had the figure 8 continuum up there, like the kind of the give and take of recognizing, it also reminded me of iMessages, and how with an iMessage I would say, I need you to know something, but at the end of the day, I'm owning my part of it. This is why I need you to do this or help me with this. And so in politics, that recognition of another person's perspective you know, or granting them, these are my deficits, so let's move to our assets. It's it's an iMessage to me. It's a way for us. It's a give and take, you know. But you also don't get there if people don't have access to give. You know, some people don't have enough leeway in their life and their consciousness to be able to, you know, submit those ideas, like out of fear. It could be danger, it could be a lot of conditions. But if they're not able to give up any leeway, then, you know, that back and forth doesn't have a chance to happen.
Thank you, Wes. Yeah, I'm gonna come back to that as well. Alicia, you have any thoughts?
I don't even know where to start. There's just a lot here. I guess one area of critique would be power dynamics. To me, seems to be missing in this framework. I think it's implicitly there, but that's something that I am grappling with, is just the thinking about worldviews and values and conditions, and, as Wes mentioned, access. There's different power dynamics at play that can either open access or prevent access to certain types of conditions, as an example. So that is something that bubbled up for me. And then also listening to Dave's story, which I thought was really helpful. I think also acknowledging the tension in the awareness of the negative manifestations that each of the different stages, you know, play out. And that within me, I think, is the tension of, you know, accepting, and that awareness, which of course that's, you know, really digging into the compassion, which is important. However, there's also that resistance work that is at play. And so so that's the tension of accepting, but also recognizing that there's work to be done to shift wherever you're at, whatever level, from unhealthy to healthy, and supporting that process, right? And so it's through resistance work, and I think that is a bit of a tension that I noticed when Dave was sharing his story. So those are just a couple things I think that came up for me in listening to just Wes, Dave, and Martin sharing their reactions.
Good, yeah, and I'm gonna maybe we'll come back to the power dynamic as well, because I think that is an important lens to put on this. And before we go on, I do want to open it up to those that are on Zoom. If you would like to jump in and share or have a question, we'd love for you to do that. If you want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to join in the conversation. If not, we'll take it a little bit further. Does anybody else have a question or a comment? Well, let's, I think looking at some of these examples, specifically keeping it into the political realm, will be important. One of the values that why it's so important is, and it's a value of how do we move our political system forward. I think we would all agree that we feel like we're at, you know, stalemates with one another, and the ways in which we've been acting only continue to perpetuate the polarization and difference between us. And so one of the challenges I think we have is we don't have spaces, and Wes, you may have been talking about this, we don't have spaces where we can do polarity mapping together, right? So that if we could get ourselves in, so it's one of it is a process question. Like, where are the spaces? What are the spaces we can create where we can invite different worldviews together to begin naming and seeing some of the positives of one another? And then if we can't get those groups together, can groups of integral thinkers come together and begin to look at policy that each of the worldview may not be able to make, but that integrative thinkers can come together and say, look, green has gone too far on this issue. It's an unhealthy manifestation of green. How can we help green see what blue is needing? So what kind of systems do we need to create? What are those spaces where integral thinkers are coming together to create forms of policy and political will or political campaigns? So I'd be interested if you all know of spaces like that. How can we create spaces like that together to reflect on that? Because in some ways, some of these worldviews, and I can appreciate that certain worldviews are threatened, that it's not just their perspective, it's that the implications of their perspective would be oppressive to me. And I think that's what we mean, Alicia, maybe that's what you're talking about. It's hard for me to let you have your perspective when the implications of your perspective means I don't have what I need in order to thrive. So I can appreciate that there may not be a lot of spaces that we can create where people can come together to do that work, because just the expression of your perspective is threatening to my well-being. And I think we're seeing that happen a lot. Anything come up for you all around that, or spaces where you are finding that to be happening?
As we worked bringing Christians and Muslims together, a lot of what we were doing was initially understanding each other, giving people space to say what they want to say, and we realized that that wasn't enough. So we moved to contact theory, where we bring people together in a structured environment to more than just know about the other, to know the other. But we found that even that wasn't sufficient. And now we're looking for intentional ways of collaboration. So once you introduce people to each other, what are projects that we can work on together that help meet the needs of the group? And that's usually based around some value that we hold in common. So as we're exploring these relationships with each other, exposing the common values and what does it mean for us both to collaborate and live into this value in a way that allows your needs to be met and my needs to be met. And in context of relationship, where I begin to genuinely care about and not just know about this other group, there seems to emerge the energy to find something that's win-win for the groups.
Yeah, thanks, Martin, and thanks for that work that you've been, a lot of good application that you all are doing in that space. What else is coming up, Wes?
Can I ask you a follow-up question? When you were able to move into contact theory, I guess, how did the power dynamics play out in those spaces where people were actually together? Was it a process of getting people to submit to the methodology, and ascribing to this plan? Or is it more helping people to, I guess, pull back some layers of their egos through some type of process and then moving into working the plan?
It's really interesting that you would ask that, because there are certainly negative power dynamics that show up initially. I remember taking Christian groups into mosque, and some of the Christians that showed up, their only purpose in going to the mosque is to meet Muslims to try to convert them to Christianity. And yet, I would go to the mosque leaders and say, I'm going to bring people into your mosque, and that's what they think they're here to do. I'm not here for that, but there's a journey that these people are on. And if we can come together and you can invest the energy as a minority, you know, Muslim population's what, 1 to 3% of the US population. So we're asking them to invest in this majority group, and you know, there's your power dynamics, so that they can begin to ask better questions and their own biases can be exposed. And that's hard work. It doesn't happen because we have a conversation about it at the door. It's in the context of relationship, these things begin to surface, and when they're surfaced, they can be dealt with or addressed. I'm not sure, Wes, that I answered your question, but that's what came to mind when you asked.
Yeah, it did, because earlier in Judd's presentation, I had put a note that context frames how values are ascribed to bodies and spaces. And so I was wondering if within the mosque, the Muslims felt more powerful, or if the Christians felt more powerful entering the mosque, and if it would interplay vice versa.
Well, I took a group of 14 Muslim friends to a large megachurch here in town. And with them, it was like we're provoking a conversation. This is contact, but it's not a conversation. You take 14 people into a large church, and the people in the church are going to have to decide how to respond to these people that are coming into their space, sort of to speak. Will they be welcoming? Will they stand off and talk about the other? Will they engage and try to learn? Will they share contact information? But after that event, the people who are in the in group, so to speak, the power holding group, has to evaluate their own perspective or their own actions. How did they respond to the other? So we've gone both ways, going into each other's space, and the dynamics are different. The dynamics would be different if I were in a Muslim majority country like Pakistan. In our organization, we have people in Bosnia and in Indonesia. And the power dynamics have to be considered, because those with power have to, at some level, be confronted with how they're managing that power.
So that, I think there's the significance of the bridging work, right? That's what I am hearing, is that there's some bridging work that is important in this process and creating these spaces. And I think really at the heart of it is really the building capacity for awareness, or skills around awareness, right? And because those who are in power, what are their skills and awareness? What are their skills for being aware of their power and being in that position? And so I think, you know, Wes's question is really getting at what we're trying to really do, is build our muscle for awareness in order to not be delusional. And then once we are aware, right, the next step is to productively, positively do something with that awareness, as opposed to not doing, you know, something. So,
and that's where I think the collaboration step is important. just bringing people together. People can say, well, I visited the mosque once, and they think that they're an authority on Muslims because they've had this encounter. But until the relationship goes deeper and we begin to care about what are the values and the concerns and the hurts of the marginalized group, we find that collaboration provokes those conversations and helps move the relationships along, hopefully in healthy ways.
Do you think in those instances it's more prevalent that the less dominant group has to learn the dialect of how to engage with the dominant group, or if that work needs to happen at the dominant level and they have to learn how to translate down?
Yes. The minority group, that's why it's so hard on the minority group, because they get tired of having to interpret everything. So that as my organization, what I would see myself as a bridge person, I would go into a church setting and say, you have questions about Islam. Let me answer them as best I can based on my experience. But really, I'm not the authority. We need to move this to contact. You need to meet people who are living these realities. But I provide, as a bridge person, a certain level of comfort on the front end of that conversation. But if we never move past classes on the other, then it's just information. It doesn't change the hearts. We don't get to the big heart side of this conversation.
Hey, Martin, I have a question on, well, first off, your wisdom and life experience. I'm really enjoying your add on the conversation. It's
Thank you.
informing me in all kinds of different ways right now. And I'm wondering, when you say that you did try to look at common values across, if I heard you right, and it's more of just wondering, like, just to start a conversation, if with this power, since there is power dynamics with what you're dealing with, what values would possibly be present that would entice people to listen, and entice people to include, entice people to be willing to give up power? What, do you feel there's any merit in identifying those common values that could be tapped and ignited, that would spark people's receptivity to hearing folks outside of their power tribe? If I'm in a power tribe, what is my motivation to get out of it and expose myself? So back to the value piece, what values might I hold that would actually be the intrinsic motivation to kind of push me through to include and be more receptive of very different points of view and lived experience?
Yeah. We approach this as a Christian organization, so we draw on the teachings and values we see exemplified in the life of Jesus. Now, I would make a distinction between that and American expressions of religion and Christianity. So when we see power dynamics or any issue that we would want to push back on, if we're trying to influence a Christian audience, we would go back to what do we see in the life and teachings and example of Jesus. And that allows us to to question the authority of leaders who have may have said something else. And I think there are implications beyond just Christianity. You know, when we read developmental politics, he was talking about finding 7 core values, kind of advocating a postmodern worldview or system. What are the values that we could agree on? And then how do we live those out? So rather than being issue specific, focus the conversation on values that we hold in common, and how can we attain that value. And sometimes the way I'm approaching this value excludes somebody else, doesn't take into account the power dynamics. But you know, Jesus was a minority himself, living under the heel of a powerful empire, and we in the Western churches too often read ourselves as the hero of the story instead of the subject of the story. So from a Christian perspective, it's redefining some of those stories of Jesus and saying there's another way to look at this, and we have found that to be helpful in a Christian context anyway.
Thank you.
So we've just got a few minutes left. I want to give us a chance to check out. Really appreciate the conversation. I feel like it could we could probably do a couple more weeks on this to begin to nail down to some deeper stuff. But we do need to pull our time together. So I want to open it up just for checkout, and I want to start with those that have joined us. Natalie and Julie or Paula, if y'all have any checkout comments. We've only got about 2 minutes left, so they need to be 15, 20-second checkouts. But just what have you heard? What's been meaningful to you? And then also would like to hear checkout from our conversation partners. Anybody want to check out?
Just thank you for everybody's perspective. I enjoyed listening.
Great. Thank you, Natalie. Julie, Paula, and either of you all want to?
This has been super interesting. I feel like I don't have a meaningful enough statement to say at the moment because I want to think about it, but I really appreciate the thoughts. And it's making me think a lot about, I've had to untangle much of my religious and worldview perspectives that I was raised in. And so it's making me kind of think through those. One of the things I think a lot about is how to help people move perspectives. So I want to give some more thought to it from that perspective as well.
Great. Thanks, Julie. Let's check out Martin, Alicia, then David, then Wes.
I appreciate the time with you. One other thing that I was thinking of was the idea of shalom, the mutual thriving of all is of value that I can use in religious context to bring people together. So I wish shalom for all of you.
Thank you, Martin. Alicia?
Yeah, the great conversation, and I really appreciate the perspectives here. And I guess what still sticks out for me that I will continue to noodle on is the power dynamics piece in this, because I definitely think this is a great framework, and I really think Steve McIntosh has some a great way to present this framework. But I think power dynamics is something that I still need to noodle on.
Good, thank you. David?
Yeah, I'm with Alicia on that. Really grateful for Wes bringing that in. I believe he brought that in. How to deal with things, not just between two different groups of people, but when you add the added complexity of power. So that added another tier of complication and interest, actually, for me.
Thank you, David. Wes?
I'm going to work on something Alicia said earlier about building my capacity around the skills and situational awareness. I think that's some marching orders that we can all go off with and take those, and so we can use our values to amplify positive qualities and not consciously or unconsciously leverage those values in the oppression of others. So if we heighten our situational awareness, we might get one step closer to that.
Great. Thank you, Wes. Well, thank you all again for the conversation. And again, the hope of these is to begin to give us as a community some shared language around application of these maps in order to create a more integrative, conscious, loving, compassionate, equitable city. Next week, we're going to focus some of these maps on what's called the integral city movement. There's been quite a bit done about applying these kind of maps to the work of creating an integral city. So I'll be pulling some of that stuff down and leading in some conversation. But again, thank you. This is important that we come together and have these conversations so we can each of us thrive and create a community where everyone else can thrive as well. For those of you who join us on Facebook, thanks for being here. And of course, the Zoom folks, always appreciative of who you are and the work you're doing in the world. And we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye all.
Peace.
Have a great week.